Now that you know who Beethoven is, let's talk about his music a little bit. Beethoven was quite the perfectionist. He would work on large pieces of music for very long periods of time before premiering them or publishing them. But he did this because he was a genius and was one of the best classical form composers of the era, if not the best classical form composer. He gave classical forms a new passion and a new range. He was known as an innovator throughout his life, especially in the later period of his life after he lost his hearing. One of the important things to know about Beethoven is that he really believed music to be a calling and philosophy, not just a form of entertainment. He loved music and what it represented and how it could affect human beings for the better. He was a despairing person who had gone through large amounts of depression in his life, and yet he always found hope in music. So it was important to him to stay alive to write this music, and then it was also important for him to bring this music to other people so that they could feel this calling towards music and know it as something that could bring them hope. He wrote in all the classical genres, but was best known for his 16 string quartets, 32 piano sonatas, and 9 symphonies. If you think back, Mozart wrote 41 symphonies, and Haydn 104. Beethoven only wrote 9. Quite stunning. We all wish he'd written so many more, and yet, because he only wrote this many, and really worked so hard to perfect them over long periods of time, they're true works of art. And these symphonies are his most popular work even today, especially the fifth and the ninth. They bridge the gap between the classical period and its elegance and the romantic period, which really believed in the idea of emotion and romance and beauty. The symphonies themselves are both joyful and despairing. The melodies lead us to always hope for something more than we have in our lives. The symphonies themselves are also larger than the symphonies by Mozart and Haydn, and all of them show how Beethoven loved classical forms, but also loved to expand them and to change them, so audiences always were hearing something new and exciting. For example, he would always write epic finales rather than using the light dancing rondos that were typical of the classic era. These epic finales were usually in sonata form, which would round out the symphony and give it a classical sense of balance, but, since they were larger, stronger forms, would also really give you a sense of finish and excitement. Beethoven was truly a genius of the classical era and was always looking forward to what the next generation of musicians and audiences might want to hear. His life and his works were the beginning of the Romantic period, even though he was the epitome of the classical period. His music can be divided into 3 periods: the early period, middle, and the late period. The early period, from 1770 to 1802, had a clear influence from Joseph Haydn and Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. In this particular period, Beethoven was very excited about his life and extremely successful, and had known Haydn and Mozart and loved their music. So, his music was clean and beautiful. It also had a very wonderful and elegant way of using the classical forms. Audiences loved it. They responded to him because of this beautiful, elegant, balanced music, but they also responded to the fact that his melodies were slightly darker and more interesting than some of the melodies created by Haydn and Mozart. They really reflected Beethoven's personality and his virtuosity, and it's why people then began to believe him to be the most popular artist of the time and the most popular composer. During the middle years of his life from 1803 to 1814, he was dealing with the repercussions of knowing he was going to go completely deaf. But he had triumphed over this realization and had gone from despairing to the point of suicide to being able to live his life with hope and passion. Because of this, he was really inspired by heroism and by the heroic figures of the time. This is then known as the heroic period. He was inspired by figures such as Napoleon Bonaparte, for example, who overcame society's rules and a lot of adversity and war to become the Emperor of France, even though he was not a member of the nobility from birth. Figures like Napoleon inspired him because they reminded him of his own overcoming of adversity. The music that was inspired by such men as Napoleon was epic and triumphant. It was exciting and hopeful, and always gave people a sense of joy when listening to it. You always felt by the end of one of these symphonies or pieces of music written in the middle period as though the story had come full circle and the heroine or the hero had won the story completely. He begins in this period to use classical forms in new ways. As I said, he liked to write epic finales. This was the period in which he really did this. He also chose to change forms in a few other ways. Whatever he chose to do, he did it because he wanted to create a bigger sense of triumph and strength in the music he was writing in this period. In the later period, from 1850 until his death in 1827, Beethoven, though he had overcome his deafness, really struggled personally not only with that, but also with the loss of lovers and people in his life. He never had the happiest existence on the planet, and he struggled with this. His music, because of this, becomes more and more complex and dark. It never loses its sense of hope, which is why I think we all still love Beethoven as much as we do. But the darkness of his life, the depressions of his life, he's not afraid of them, and he incorporates them into his music. The emotional nature of the works really connect with us as human beings. But the late period works go even a step beyond this. At a certain point, they become so difficult to listen to because of their complexities and because of the emotion that they're very hard for us to listen to because they really show the truth, the beauty, the despair in life. His music affects us all, especially this music from the late period. The first listing example is taken from the early period. It's the piano sonata in C minor, opus 13, known as the Pathétique Sonata. This literally means pathetic. It's the nickname that Beethoven himself gave to the sonata. Remember, he was the one writing this music and performing the premieres of this music. So he wrote these melodies for himself, and in this case, he wrote a tragically passionate melody that he considered to be the best example of a man sick with love or pathetic with love, that was in love with a woman he couldn't have. That's the story behind this music, and I wonder when you listen to it if you'll really be able to hear that. It's a stormy melody, and it goes back and forth between slower melodies and fast melodies, because it's really exemplifying how he used emotion in music, even though he was using typical classical form. He was 27 years old when he wrote the sonata, and it's still one of his most popular piano sonatas today. For your listening, you're only required to listen to movement 1, the grave, that moves then to the allegro molto e con brio. I've provided a link to the full piece of music in case you wish to listen to the other movements. They're beautiful movements. I hope you will give them all a chance. But you only have to listen to movement 1 because it's a great example of sonata form, but also a great example of this idea of beautiful classical music and how you can incorporate an emotional storyline into such music. Pages 191 to 192 of your text give a great outline of the melodies and the form of the first movement of this work. Symphony No. 5 in C minor, opus 67, is the next work you need to be listening to. This is an example of his middle period, the heroic, triumphant period of his music, when he had overcome the despair in his life and really hoped for a great future even with deafness. He used the classical forms in this period, but again, he really managed to make them more than they used to be with Haydn and Mozart. In the third movement, he still used dance form, but he no longer thought that the minuet and trio really had enough character. So he created a new form of a dance called a scherzo that was in a faster tempo than the minuet and trio and was in a duple meter rather than a triple. Another expansion that he used was to create movements that had no pauses between them. Typically, movements had space between them because they stood as full pieces of music unto themselves, but then were a part of a greater piece of music. In this case, specifically in this symphony, he combines movement 3 and 4 into one larger movement, even though it's two movements together. It's quite exciting and dramatic because it literally leads into a new exciting triumphant theme. You can hear when movement 4 begins, even if you know nothing about music, because it changes from a pianissimo texture in a triple meter with the timpani giving us a very steady beat and the strings getting louder and louder and more excited until all of a sudden the brass comes in with a huge triumphant fanfare. Again, this is a great example of this heroic finale that he started to use in the middle period. This was his most popular symphony then and is still his most popular symphony today. The short melody from the first movement, ba-ba-ba-bum, is something that has been used in commercials, films. It's been covered and sampled by many popular artists, and we all know it in one form or another. It unifies the piece of music because it's used in all the different movements. This piece of music was written in 1807 to 1808. He took over a year to compose it to make sure it was really perfect and wonderful for us to listen to. For the listening, you're required to listen to the entire symphony, not only because I want you to really understand what these classical symphonies sound like, but because this is an exceptional piece of music. It has great movement form, and it's really exciting. And you've probably all heard it at one point or another. The second movement in particular is one of my favorites because it's a great example of a theme and variation. But it's actually a double theme and variation. He uses two different melodies in the form. I've provided you with links, not only to the full piece, but to each particular movement, just in case you want to listen to one movement at a time. I've also created a few extra links for your listening pleasure, including a link to a graphic score of the first movement, because that seemed to be something you all responded to quite well when we listened to the little fugue. So if you'd rather listen to that particular example of the first movement, feel free. For the second, third, and fourth movement, there's no graphic score available, but I think you'll enjoy watching the video I've provided. I've also included just one funny example of how this particular symphony has been used over time as a piece of art and theater. Use the listening guide in your book. It's a few pages long, and it does a great job of outlining the forms of these movements, where the melodies are in these movements, and how Beethoven actually wrote this piece of music. Finally, I want you listening to the String Quartet Opus 133, the Grosse Fuge. This is the height of Beethoven's late period. It's a very difficult work to perform, and it is a very difficult work to listen to. I'm not trying to confuse you by making you listen to this piece of music. I'm simply trying to help you understand that music is always changing, it's always transitioning. And by the end of Beethoven's life, he'd moved from this epic, heroic, classical form onto something much more complicated, much different, something that was leading composers of the next generation into a new era called the Romantic era. Audiences did not understand this particular movement when it was originally written as a finale for one of his other string quartets in the late period, so Beethoven felt that it should stand on its own and wrote it out as a separate piece of music. So this is a full string quartet even though it's one movement. He rewrote a different finale for that other earlier string quartet. This piece of music is a double fugue. Remember back to what a fugue is. Beethoven he was inspired by those old forms, but he didn't want to keep it that simple, so he actually created a double fugue, one that uses two different melodies at the same time. So sometimes there are up to 8 melodies playing at once with only 4 players. So you can imagine how ridiculously hard this piece of music is to perform, let alone to understand. It's probably the least accessible of Beethoven's music, but you're listening to it for a very important reason. As I've said, you need to understand that his music changed because he changed as a person, just as Haydn or Mozart or Vivaldi or any other of the composers we've listened to change. This is a great piece of music, and the more you listen to it, the more you want to listen to it because you want to understand it better. You want to know why he wrote this piece of music. What was he feeling when he wrote this piece of music? Why did he make it so very complicated? Remember, he was entirely deaf when he wrote this piece of music. Does that make this piece of music crap? Does it make it something that we don't want to listen to? Or does it have a lot of worth because he was able to hear something in his mind, put it on paper, and give it to people to play even though no one else had ever heard anything like it before? There's no listening outline for this piece of music in the text. It's not even mentioned in the text. But I want you to listen to this piece of music. It is required. Even though it's difficult to understand, it's a fantastic example of how his later works sounded. Try to imagine while you're listening to this that the person who wrote it was completely deaf. How much ahead of its time it was. How much more complicated than the other things you've listened to this week and last week. This piece of music was written for a future generation, not necessarily for the people who would listen to it while he lived. Remember that music is always changing. Beethoven's late music was what helped lead the next generation of composers into the Romantic period. This music leads us into a new style of music that is exciting, and honestly, you'll probably all really like the Romantic period music because it's much more like what we're used to listening to today. Enjoy this music, really listen to it, and then enjoy writing and thinking about it in the group discussion boards. Good luck on your exam for this week, and if you have any questions, feel free to post them in the FAQ forum or send me an email.